And Alex is a native of Atlanta, Georgia, who graduated from Riverwood International Charter School in May of this year. He is one of 38 Ivy diploma candidates in his graduating class of 395 and was in the top 20 students of his class. He is a recipient of the University of Georgia Certificate of Merit in 2013 and was on the principal's list at his school for every semester he attended. He has studied Japanese for 7 years and Mandarin Chinese for 2 years, in addition to studying other languages such as Korean on his own. He was a participant in SPICE's Rush Hour Scholars Program in 2012 and looks forward to studying political science and the cultures of East Asia in college. So, without further ado, here's Alex.
Machii, Hisayuki, okay. Machii, Hisayuki, and the Koreans of the Yakuza. Okay, so due to a low homicide rate and strict gun laws, one is usually not used Japan in crime in this instance. So when you do think of Japan in crime, you usually think of heavily tattooed, black suit wearing men, such as the Yakuza. As you can see in these photos here, so you got the heavily tattooed men right here, just visuals that get a big factor. On the bottom, you have the general black suit wearing. Black suits are usually reserved for people, so you can tell the guy. And that's a screenshot from a famous US video game entitled Yakuza. So you can tell that that's generally what some people think of with the Yakuza. So one of the key components of the Yakuza that made it easy for Koreans is called the Oyebun-Kobu relationship. Oyebu meaning parent, Kobu meaning child. And with it, when this relationship was maintained well, the harmony of the group, Wa, is kept intact. And as you can see, this is the character Wa. It can mean Japanese, but it also means harmony. You might see some people with tattoos with it. But the Koreans, they found value in the Yakuza for 2 reasons. One, loyalty is valued over ethnicity. And two, Koreans were able to become acclimated to Japanese societal customs, which usually denied because of grandparents' name. So inclusiveness had always been a part of the Yakuza, dating back to the days of the Hakugo and Kakia gangs, which were peddlers at the east and stuff, because the Yakuza would protect people from them, and they recruited anyone they can to help, including the Burekumi, who were the lower class people, usually undertakers who were undesirable professions. Alright. So Koreans in Japan after the war were a group known as the Sango. These are the Japanese characters. It means free, country, because that included Taiwanese and Chinese as well, who were brought to Japan to do labor for the soldiers that had gone to war to support Japan. And most of the Koreans that had been brought, there were 2.6 brought in total. 2 million eventually left and returned to Korea. The remaining 600,000 remained in Japan to try and apply for trades. But American authorities did help out Koreans because after the war they generally distrusted Japanese, but they returned to the Koreans who lived in Japan for informant jobs. And Alex didn't brought that later. But originally the Yakuza as a nationalist and far-right group, they had attacked the foreigners, but then they began to see value in them as well. So basically, it's similar to how corporations, instead of competing with the Korean gangs, you do what you do, you absorb them. So that's what happened with the Korean gangs and the Yakuza. So they're more concerned about maintaining control and preventing petty crimes than worrying about ethnicity in the period of Japan. And it made up for a lackluster police force, which in general didn't do its job after the war due to lack of discussion. And the Yakuza syndicates, as I said, began absorbing Korean gangs to bolster their numbers and prevent unorganized crime like thieves and single person. This is the label of the Boakai. It's what the Bosekai began later. I'll explain what the Bosekai is, but that's the character for East and the Alright, so discriminate. So Zainichi Koreans, Zainichi meaning staying in Japan, were often forced in the lives of crimes simply due to rampant discrimination against the black people. after the occupation ended, Zainichi Koreans, with most of them knowing Japanese better than Korean, were still classified legally as aliens, were denied housing, employment, and education. So basically, these people in Japan, they had two undesirable choices: stay in a country that hates them, or return home to one that was heading towards war, with the Korean War and the Japan Peninsula. And so now we can come to the most famous Korean in the Yakuza, Machii Hisayuki. He was born Jongdon-young in Japanese-occupied Korea in 1923, but his dad, as a steel merchant, had spent a lot of time in Japan, and that brought him there before, so he's very familiar with the culture. And in his 20s, he had finally moved to Japan after trying college but not liking it, and started the Toseikai, which means Voice of the East Gang. And it was the first major Korean syndicate of the Yakuza that precedent in the future. So by 1948, the Toseikai was known as the Ginza Police, for their tight ship. They ran a tight ship that basically the police force in the popular Tokyo shopping district of Ginza, which is in Korea, but it's pretty important, where they controlled bars and they controlled concessions for pachinko parlors. By 1960, the gang had 1,500 members, and while it wasn't the biggest syndicate in Japan, they were known as the most ruthless, so they became very well known. And that picture right there, that's Machii. It's hard to find pictures, but that's the most famous. So, as I previously said, Machii's gang controlled the Ginza district, and he was known personally as the Ginza Tiger, and both Ginza. And as a Korean, he took advantage of this because the U.S. officials were still in Japan, so he used his Korean ethnicity to get better positions, I guess. He became an informant for U.S. officials, and then used his gang members as strikebreakers and thugs, which pleased the U.S. because they were concerned that Japan was becoming communist, so they would like to see organized labor put down. And then he managed to broker some pretty high-profile deals for his gang, including having his gang work security at Dwight D. Eisenhower's business in 1960. So, and that's a book about him. It's called, that translates as The Man Called the Wild Ox. And then I guess that was one of his nicknames too. So, as a Machii was obviously a strident anti-communist, and he grew support behind the pro-South Korea group Mindan. So look right here, that's Japanese. The pro-South Korean group in Japan, and then viciously attacked his North Korean counterpart, Songyong. And he became a personal friend of South Korean President, dictator Park Chung-hee, and who shared his, virulently anti-communist views. And he also, through Park with agents of the notorious Korean Central Intelligence Agency, SKSP. So the most infamous of his things ever was the kidnapping of future Korean President Kim Dae-jung, which some of you may have heard of, some of you may not, but I'll explain. So basically, Kim Dae-jung, he ran against Park Chung-hee in the 1971 Korean presidential election and lost. But it was a highly contested election. And after that, he had left Korea to go around the world and talk about democracy, because that obviously was not happening in South Korea. So when he was in Japan, Kim was kidnapped, drugged, bound, gagged, and nearly thrown off a boat until a military plane flew over, started pursuing the boat, at which point they abandoned the plane. He came home and was put under house arrest and was killed, but later became the president of South Korea. And Machii's, while it's not completely confirmed, Machii's believed to be the culprit, since Park authorized the deed. The KCIA had been proven to be involved, and all rooms on Kim's floor in the hotel where he was staying were rented to Korean Yakuza and KCIA agents. So, and that's what the presidential poster for Kim Dae-jung back in the 1970s, younger guy. So one of the biggest things that Machii did, along with his friend Toshio Kodama, was campaigning for the approval of the Republic of Korea-Japan Normalization Treaty, or Treaty for Basic Relations. It would establish in diplomatic relations. And he and his associates frequently met with Park, and with Park's blessing, Machii gained control over a ferry line between South Korean city of Busan and the Japanese city of Shimamiseki, which is the shortest route between the countries. And he also hosted diplomats at his clubs in both Tokyo and Seoul, so kind of facilitating their meetings and working towards the eventual passage of the law. And you can also say he probably had ulterior motives too, because he wanted his wealth. He built a 7-story luxury complex in Roppongi, which went under after a few years. So he was pretty well. Right, that picture is kind of bad. And So many people often deride him because they believe he opened up South Korea to crime in the world. Well, in the words of author Alex Pro, the Yakuza playground for the Yakuza. And he had in fact made it easier for Japanese fugitives to hide out in South Korea. And he'd also organized high-stakes gambling wars of the country, which he takes some Japanese people on. And then the Yakuza began moving their typical businesses like loan sharking, drugs, and construction, prostitution. They started moving those to South Korea. So that's another picture. Bad quality. So then we move to organized crime for reason. So whether directly or indirectly, the presence of the Yakuza in Japan led to the eventual formation of the Kamite, which you may know as the Korean Kamite. And President Park, he had suppressed this idea because he didn't want any kind of organized opposition against him, but once he died, the numbers began exploding. And the Yakuza and these three groups even formed alliances, such as one controlled liquor industry in Korea back in the 1990s. And then it was even discovered that the Yakuza had been training the Kamite in Japan when a police raid revealed that there were documents saying that they found some weapons and such. And that's just a picture. We can't really find one for Korean mafia, so Korean guys. And so now, well, Koreans in the Yakuza. Koreans were often able to move up in the Yakuza because, one of the theories is that Korea is a major transshipment point for drugs that would go into Japan from the mainland. So many of them were trusted with those kind of responsibilities, maybe dealing with the authorities and all that, because you have the knowledge to do that. And today, Koreans make up 30% of the 90,000 documented or known by the Yakuza. And if you look in the map further, that's 3% of the total Zainichi Korean population. And that doesn't seem like much, but then remember that only 0.4% of Japanese people are in the Yakuza. So it's higher, and that's still the discrimination. Oh, that was a picture of some controversial persons. Yeah. So the question would be, what did he do? Well, some might say he turned the public against the Yakuza because he was a foreigner. When they saw a foreigner rise to power, they started thinking, the Yakuza must be the work of foreigners, so we have to get rid of it. So they began to see it as a foreign influence, as an embarrassment for counter to Japanese ideals, and that it only caused further discrimination and xenophobia. As you can see in this picture here, let's say they spell the gangs in Japanese. You can tell that they're drawn to purposely look down Japanese with dark skin and light hair, all that, so they can show like it's not our problem, it's not our fault. And so, it's called the rebel with the cause. And I say that because despite his less than notable profession, it can't be denied that he played a major role in the forming of Japanese and Korean relations, and was indeed a voice for the Korean people in Japan, whether desirable or not. So making him the true voice of the East.
I guess it's a two-part question. One is, was the subject or topic open to you, like your choice? And if it was, what made you choose that as your topic, or him as your topic?
It was definitely open, but she did encourage us to kind of think outside of the box a bit. So I didn't want to do something like K-pop or the Korean War. She was saying she didn't want 5 presentations about the Korean War. I don't blame her. So I've heard a lot about the Yakuza, and I heard something about a Korean before, so I decided to further into it, and I came to Mr. Hisayuki.
All right, thank you.
Oh, I enjoyed that. Thank you. University of Georgia graduate. Go Dogs. All right. Okay. So, when you were doing research on this, did you uncover or notice any patterns of, okay, so the Japanese don't like these foreigners, the Koreans, and sort of a relationship between this mafia, for lack of a better word, and sort of just pre-existing attitudes towards the Koreans who live there already? Because, you know, we have an issue today with Koreans and Japan not faring well academically, socially. And do you know if any of that has to do with sort of when Japanese people look at Koreans, they're like, ah, remember these are the mafia people or anything like that? Did you find any kind of overlay in your research?
I don't know, it's kind of a difficult question because I think just in general, the general consensus turned against the Yakuza because in the 1990s or the 80s, they passed the Boylston countermeasures law, which targeted all Yakuza, not just Koreans. But then people saw people like Machii and saw that it was Korean, and then they began to thought it must be the work of the Koreans, they're doing this. So it's just plain to blame.
Two questions. First of which, how are you aware of the Sejong Scholar Program? And then secondly, you know, to what would you attribute your interest in East Asian culture and East Asian history? Where does that stem from?
Well, Sejong, I had done the Bright Shower Scholars Program with back there, and I saw this, but I did Bright Shower in 2012, and then I saw they're starting Korean one, but I missed the deadline, so I applied last year. And my interest in East Asian studies, I guess it was just the place furthest away from what I am. I'm like full white. I never had that kind of influence in my family, so when I learned about it when I was younger, when I started taking Japanese, I really thought it was something I can't find. So,
Alex, thank you for the wonderful presentation. I'm curious about your process and the research that you've done. And despite this is an online course, so you can't necessarily go into school each day and ask for help from your teacher, because your teacher is virtual. So can you share a little bit, what were some of your biggest challenges for actually getting the fine-tuned research that you needed for this particular project? And any other obstacles maybe you ran into along the way and how you encountered them to come up with this fantastic project?
I would say the sources would be the biggest issue because there are a lot of books published about it in Japan, but you can't find those locally here. So I kind of had to just look for books about the Yakuza and take bits and pieces from each one. These are the sources I had. I kind of decided to go into ones about the Yakuza and then narrow it down to what I wanted. And that took some time, but I was able to find some good stuff. So. And generally, I don't want to say self-motivated, but kind of a old career like you. I don't really ask for help all the time. I should, but I don't. And, well, I guess it turned out okay here, so I don't regret it.